in December when that was finalized. It is available electronically on our website, as are our prior year CAFRs as well. And once a year, once this is completed, we extend the invitation to our audit firm to come in and present audit findings, as well as just cover a little bit of basics on our financials, and then just looking forward, any big changes in the law, GASB, things to be aware of. With that said, I'll turn it over to Bill Seymour. He is a partner with SB and Company, who have been our audit firm for the past several years.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Once again, my name is Bill Seymour. I'm the engagement partner with SB and Company, and this represents our required communications under generally accepted auditing standards as well as our firm standards. As Michelle had mentioned, really an opportunity to have a conversation about the audit and to entertain any questions about the audit process or results from those charged with governance, or if you will, yourselves. We have a presentation. I believe everybody has a printout version of that. I will walk through this fairly high level. Please feel free to stop me at any time with any questions that you have. So starting on slide 5, is the scope of services which we are engaged to perform, which is a financial statement audit of the June 30, 2017 financial statements, performance of a federal grant compliance or uniform guidance single audit, review of the uniform financial report, that is taking your financial statements and putting them in a fit and format for the State of Maryland Department of Legislative Services, the data collection form, which takes the single audit information and puts it in a fit and format for the federal government, as well as working with management on a year-round basis. The results of the audit, we have issued an unmodified or clean audit opinion on the financial statements. That's the best opinion that I'm allowed to issue under generally accepted auditing standards. It effectively says that the financial statements as presented by management are reasonably free of material misstatement. We discovered no instances of fraud, nor were we made aware of any material instances of fraud. Our audit, however, is not a fraud audit. A fraud audit would be different in scope. However, we are required to, and we do, maintain a healthy skepticism for fraud, to ask about fraud, to look for fraud in the areas that we test. However, that was significantly less in scope than had be if this were a fraud audit. And as I mentioned, we were required to bring it to your attention if we discovered any instances, which we did not. We discovered no material weaknesses or significant deficiencies in internal controls, and we received the full cooperation of management. High level, on an entity-wide basis, or if you will, following the almost what would be akin to a private sector format, the city's change in that position increased by about $1.6 million this year. We have a detailed slide on that later. We had no audit journal entries other than reclasses for financial reporting purposes, and we'll discuss in a moment some of the upcoming changes as a result of OPEB. Our audit process on slide 8 is a risk-based audit approach that the idea is we spend time to identify the areas of highest potential risk of material misstatement, and then look at how management has designed and operated controls to mitigate that risk, perform certain analytical procedures and substantive procedures, as well as gas compliance items that allow us to ultimately arrive at that unmodified opinion. On slide 9, we assess the control environment using the COSO model of internal controls. That is the 5 interrelated components: control environment, risk assessment, the specific control activities, information and communication, and monitoring. In all areas, our assessment was that it was effective. Had we had issues during the course of the audit, we used terms like significant deficiency, material weakness here. We had none of those items that we would be required to bring to your attention. Diving down a little bit deeper, we also look at the key processes and underlying functions as they relate to the preparation of the financial statements: treasury, estimation, financial reporting, and that's looking at a combination of the test of controls as well as substantive procedures. And you can see through the processes here: expenditures, payroll, revenue, and fixed assets. We had no concerns that we need to bring to your attention. We had no problems, no findings. As I mentioned, we had no journal entries. And so, if you will, from a 30,000-foot level, when you look at that, what that effectively tells us is that the information that management prepares as part of their process is accurate. We didn't have to come in and make lots of changes to get to a GAAP acceptable set of financial statements, which tells us that the processes that are in place for the information that you receive during the year are accurate and provide reasonable information. Financial statement highlights, if you look overall on governmental activities, the total net position is just over $50.5 million. However, if you note that roughly about $67 million of that is invested in capital assets, and that is your capital assets less the related debt for those amounts, which causes an unrestricted deficit of roughly about $26 million. And then when you factor that with the business type activities, on a net basis, we're almost break even. Bearing in mind that includes roughly about a $50 million liability for the net pension liability, which was recorded in the financial statements for the first time 2 years ago. And so, if you will, that is the difference between the assets in the pension plan as well as what the actuary estimates as the total potential liability, which is both the single employer plan as well as the city's participation in the Maryland State Retirement System. There's nothing in these numbers that we had issues with that we need to bring to your attention as part of the audit. And then on slide 15 is the 3-year running of the statement of changes or in net position, excuse me. And you can see that for the most part, numbers are fairly consistent year over year, and we have once again, no real issues that we need to bring to your attention. This year, we were required under GASB Statement 74 to adopt certain new footnote disclosures as they relate to reporting for other post-employment benefit plans, i.e. Retiree health insurance. Next year, you will be required to implement GASB 75, which is governmental accounting for financial or for OPEB. And effectively, what the difference is 74 really changed some of the actuarial calculations as well as some of the footnotes. 75 will place that liability that is now disclosed in the footnotes on the face of the financial statements. So, if you will, as of June 30, 2017, the city had a net OPEB liability of just under $28 million. And also, as of June 30, 2017, under the old GASB accounting, 45 accounting, we actually had a net OPEB asset. And so what happens is that we have moved from a funding-based accounting to a liability-based accounting. Previously, what GASB had said is that if a government makes the required payments, we have this kind of off-balance sheet asset and off-balance sheet liability that over time will net to zero. And that was changed with the adoption for pensions, where what GASB wanted to do is get out of the business of having accounting set funding decisions, and rather just to say, management can make whatever funding decisions they would like. We'll just book what the ending liability would be for that. So for this year, we continue to follow the old accounting, which would be that you've actually overfunded your ARC, or your annual required contribution for OPEB. So we have an asset on the books for roughly about $3 million. Next year, that asset will go away, along with recording a liability of $27.9 million, or roughly our net position would decrease by roughly about $30 million. So when I mentioned earlier that $26 million deficit, that $26 million deficit will increase roughly to about $56 million, provided what is allocated to the enterprise funds. What I would tell you from rating agency perspective, this is a non-issue because this information had been previously disclosed as part of required supplemental information. We just use the term unfunded actuarial accrued liability as opposed to net OPEB liability. There's some slight differences in the actuarial items, but if you will, they're related liabilities and they remain in approximately the same, or if you will, kind of the same family. So rating agencies have already factored this liability into their rating of the city for that, and I would tell you from my personal conversations with them, the liability isn't the big item. What the big item is what the city's plan is and what is the city's history of funding that liability, which once again, going back to you've overfunded, which would be a good thing from a rating agency perspective. One item with I would note, if the city were to make decisions to decrease funding, there's one tricky part of this, and it's the same item with pensions, that the actuary does a calculation to determine when the pension plan or the OPEB plan, the trust, will run out of money. At that point forward, they use a discount rate that's commensurate with a AA 20-year borrowing, roughly 3.5%. Your discount rate currently is 7.5%. So if you, when they did this calculation, they factor what is your history of funding, plus your current assets, plus then what the projected investment returns, projected benefit payments are, to determine whether they believe that the fund will run out of money. So for this year, because of your history of funding, they didn't project that you would run out of money, so you have a 7.5% discount rate. If you stop funding it, then what will happen is potentially you'll meet that crossover point, and then we will have a higher or lower discount rate, which will make that a higher liability, if that makes sense. So from an accounting perspective, keep funding it the way you are, and you won't have to worry about that.
And Mr. Mayor, I had no conversation, I'm on the record, I have had no conversations with Mr. Seymour prior to his arrival. Anything related to OPEB, just saying. Thank you for that.
Well, but thank you. If you, the facts are, if you don't fund it, the unfortunate part is then, because there's a shorter window, what happened is, with pensions, we've had pension accounting for 20-something years before we moved to the liability. For OPEB, we have accounting for roughly 6 or 7 years. So we have a much shorter window that we are using as our basis to project whether or not that funding will be there. So if you miss 1 year, 1 out of 7 is different than 1 out of 25.
And the good news is, we were early on in doing this, and we would be very poor decision to start it out early and be ahead of the curve just to fall behind.
Yep. And if it, not that you want to take pride in, but I have other clients who haven't even set up a trust yet, and they will have to record 100% of the liability on the face of their financial statements. You guys are nowhere near there. So, and I will confirm that we never talked about this, other than the accounting of what stuff where goes where. The remainder of our presentation, I won't go through these in specifics, as our specific required communications. This would be our opportunity to kind of give you a look of underneath the hood of the audit. Have we had lots of problems? Have we had disagreements with management on application of accounting principles? Have we had lots of audit adjustments? Have we had fraud or illegal acts? Have we had material weaknesses, disagreements, those types of items? We really have none of those that we have to bring to your attention. We did receive a management representation letter. There's nothing special in that other than what the AICPA requires us to get. If you would like a copy of that, I'd be more than happy to provide it to you. There's been no consultation with other accountants, i.e. opinion shopping. And lastly, we are independent of the city. We go through a process on an annual basis to ensure that, and I can certify to you that we are. And I will stop there and see if there's any questions that you have from the audit. I want to thank Michelle and her group for getting all the information that we needed to be able to get through the audit. We were able to get through the audit timely. Like I said, really no big issues. So thank you very much, and for putting up with us and all the questions that we have to ask.
Yeah, I just want to thank everybody and just emphasize that it's nice that this annual report is like typical, and I am sure that it is not necessarily typical for you with all of your clients, but I can't remember the last time we had an annual report that wasn't almost identical to this. And that's a fine reflection on our financial staff.
I agree.
Anybody else? Okay.
And if I could, just one note. I will be back in about a month or a couple of weeks, because we are already in January, just to cover fiscal year 18 where we currently are, and of course, we're already starting our fiscal year 19 budget preparations, or entry. But the $49.9 million that was on our financial statements at June 30, 2017 for the unfunded pension liability, $49.9 million was the total for both, as Bill mentioned, our share and allocation from the Maryland State Retirement Pension, but also our police and fire. The way that allocates and breaks down is 39.9 is on the government or mostly in the general fund side, and 10 million is within our utility fund. The reason why it seems a little bit more, I don't want to say lopsided, but a little bit more heavily a liability on the general fund than it is in business type. Maryland State Pension, our unfunded share was 20.2 million, but our police and fire, which is 100% contained within the general fund, was 29.7 million. So just to give you a little bit of a breakdown, all that information is in the CAFR. I am always available if there's any questions to go through this separately, or if you have questions, because I know, once a year you see the combined citywide statements where typically we focus on looking at just the general fund and the individual funds. So the numbers are different when you look at them combined. But thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Bill.
All right, County Phase 1 Plan for Fire Services. Chief Lure and Dave Hayes, the Director of Emergency Services for Washington County.
Council, good evening.
Hello?
Thanks for having me.
Good afternoon. I think Director Hayes is no stranger to Mayor and Council, with the note exception, maybe new council member McIntyre. But he's here to talk about Phase 1 of the staffing plan for Washington County and the impacts here in the city. So with that said, I'll turn it over to Director Hayes. Dave.
Thank you, Chief. So what I've brought for you tonight should have been in your packets, are basically about 4 or 5 slides that are excerpts from the presentation that I did for Mayor and Council back in October. I'm sorry, for the Board of County Commissioners back in October. And the results of that presentation were brought forth out of County Resolution 2014-17 that established a response threshold that departments were expected or requested to meet. And if they were not able to do that for 2 consecutive months in a 24-month period, or 2 consecutive quarters in any period, that it would trigger a investigative process through the Washington County Volunteer Fire and Rescue Association to see what the underlying issues might be, if they were correctable, and not in a punitive response, but more in some type of response to try to make a difference. So Potomac Valley, actually 4 days after I came on board as the director, February 1 of 2016, was issued its first notification that it had a violation of that resolution. And then almost 365 days later, the second violation occurred again. Both of those, the Volunteer Fire and Rescue Association, which are here in our audience as well, conducted a review of the circumstances affecting Potomac Valley, and by Potomac Valley's own comments, they felt that they had done everything they could. They're in a very rural area. They don't have large residential communities to attract additional volunteers, and then they continue to see a decline in the number of volunteer hours that any one volunteer had to provide. So with that, they had made the request softly in 2016, and then officially they made that in writing to the Division of Emergency Services and the Volunteer Fire and Rescue Association to consider augmenting their volunteer staffing with county career staffing. Obviously, as Mayor and Council knows, and certainly the Board of County Commissioners were aware at that point, the division did not have funding in its budget to employ career firefighters outside of our Special Operations Station over on Frederick Street, which resides in the corporate limits of Hagerstown. And even that solution and those firefighters were part-time and were subjected to other jurisdictions' needs, whether they were on overtime scenarios that might befall them because of routine staff call-outs or vacancies, or when we get into inclement weather, as we saw in January of 2016, mandatory holdovers at their primary employers. Our Special Operations Station was routinely without staffing, And if not for the generosity of Chief Lure, we would have been in a position that that would have been unstaffed for significant periods of time during Winter Storm Jonas. So coming forward, you can see the response statistics there. They're in your handout and they're up on the screen. For Potomac Valley specific, and in their third quarter of 2015, second quarter 2016, second quarter again in 2017, and third quarter of 2017, they were in excess of the 5% allowable fail rate. Now, that means that an apparatus got out from that department on the required calls, at least driver only, or more. What I can tell you historically we've seen in our leadership roles and in consultation with the Volunteer Fire and Rescue Association is a decline over the past several years in the number of volunteers that we can put on a fire truck. So while we're getting the fire truck out, we're seeing the number of volunteers on any one fire truck start to decline as well. At this point, we're probably somewhere in about a 54% understaffed rate, which means 3 or more firefighters on a piece of fire apparatus for a fire call. So we already covered that Potomac Valley has initiated a request for county staffing, and their first due response area covers about 25 square miles. Their call volume represents about 5% of the entire county volume as a whole. And with the plan that we've brought forward, we understood that in no circumstance could we or should we try to replace the volunteers. It was only intent to try to augment and provide additional resources to the volunteers as we all continue to provide services to the citizens of Washington County. And I think simply put, and I actually coined this from Administrator Slocum, this is a belt and suspenders approach. This is not overhead. This is not additional supervisory positions. These are targeted in a small effort to put boots on the street, meaning firefighters in the seats of fire trucks.
Your number 2 slide's still in display, so you can make that.
All right. So the number 2 slide, I apologize, I didn't realize, it actually shows somewhat, well, it looks like you each have that actually well displayed in yours, but I'm not sure why we're having a visual problem. We had that through the emails I submitted as well, but it is represented, and I can provide that for the news media if we need to. It's just a graduated increase in the fail rate. You can see that line runs linear, and it continues to go up, and it peaks, and it drops off, but the one thing we see over the last 5-year period is a gradual incline if you draw a linear graph up through that. So going through the recommendations and planning, for us, it really realigns the intent and use of our current special operations part-time staff. We have 19 part-time employees that currently work for the county as firefighters, and they operate out of our Frederick Street station. That's our special operations station. They take care of our technical rescues. Examples would be swift water, hazardous material, confined space, high angle, and similar type events. There are a technically trained group of individuals. There are many firefighters out in the county that have similar training, but that group is targeted for those specific trainings. They do provide support to the Hagerstown Fire Department in those areas, and as well as general structural firefighting responses. The caveat to that staff and what we tried to do with the county staffing is we understood if we hired any number of full-time firefighters and used them in the county, the need might vary from day to day at which station needs help and what hours during the day that they would need that help. So what we tried to do was free up the part-time staff from special operations and replace those with 8 full-time firefighters that will work for Washington County. Their primary station location will be Special Operations Station 20 on Frederick Street. Those 19 part-time firefighters will actually work out in the county on what we call an as-needed basis, meaning if a station announces it has a hole next Wednesday from 6 a.m. till 4:30 p.m., we'll target those part-time hours in that hole. And our goal was really to target those holes so that when we have people working, we truly know that we need career staffing on that given day. The emphasis is to make sure that we get drivers on fire trucks to get them out, with the hope and understanding that the volunteers will continue to bring forth a solid effort, which they still do today, and we can put more than 1 or 2 people on any given fire truck. We expect there will probably be some scenarios where we don't have some of the part-time staff available because, again, their availability is based on their primary job obligations and other family obligations. There may be some scenarios where we need to put some of the full-time staff out into the county on an overtime scenario, but we do not expect that to be large, and it certainly isn't something that we have a significant budget to encumber. This is not a staffing solution. So we want to make sure that that's clear. We made that statement at the Board of County Commissioners, and I'll make that statement here again today. The solution is a more defined staffing plan that is more balanced between career and volunteer, and probably is more heavily laden with full-time staffing versus part-time staffing. Some may know, I think certainly some sitting at this table, my previous 16 years before working with the county is I was the Assistant Chief of Community Rescue Service and managed a staff of 5 medic units staffed with a variation of about 40 full-time staff, and then another iteration of 30 to 40 part-time staff, depending on what time of the year and what our staffing numbers were. But what we found there through years and years and years of staffing and trying to guarantee staffing and a balance between volunteer and career was we needed about an 80-20 mix, 80% full-time, 20% part-time, to be able to guarantee we could augment those volunteer hours when we needed those. Anything short of that, the schedule got very volatile. We have seen that exact replication at our special operations station. Not that those people aren't working their hearts out, not that they're not giving everything that they can, but again, many times the moon and the stars align and they're just not available. So for us, our position was to work the full-time there. That provides an inherent benefit, I think, to the Hagerstown Fire Department. It's 2 additional full-time firefighters that are guaranteed to be working every day. And they're fully trained and fully practiced in all aspects of fire protection and emergency medical response. The cost for that in the current FY18 budget is $461,000 is what we moved into wages. We have about $8,000 in hiring costs and then about $25,000 to equip them. That would be anywhere from the uniforms that you see us wearing today to the actual structural firefighting gear that they would wear if we were involved in some type of firefighting activity. The total budgetary transfer for us this year was $494,000. We expect in ongoing years with the full year salary and the corrected wages with the 3.5, that will be slightly north of $500,000. What I can tell you is with the plan, it's what we've titled it as Phase 1. Phase 2 is what begins what I would tell you the definition of what a solution might look like. And really all we tried to do for the Board of County Commissioners was show them a roadmap. This doesn't mean this can't be changed. It doesn't mean it's etched in stone, it's a rock, it's unbendable. It only means that when you're charged with things much like this mayor and council is for long-term strategic planning, and we can see things that we believe are on the horizon, it's our job to identify it and to cost value it and present that to the Board of County Commissioners, and that's what we tried to bring forward with phases 2, 3, 4, and 5 of that staffing plan. And each of those bring on larger numbers of career staffing, and they start to bring on some supervision, because again, when we get to potentially 30, 40, 50 county full-time staff working in the field, we would not have the resources inside our current Division of Emergency Services to manage that. Now, I don't mean necessarily manage that operationally, meaning in the middle of the firefight, as much as I mean administratively. There are all kinds of things that come on when you start to bring on staffing, from the HR side of it to interfacing with the corporations at a local level, making the best effort to take care of problems when they're small instead of big. All of those things that in our current structure, if we had staffing throughout the entire county, might take us upwards a week to actually get to that station the time we cycled through that. So we would need additional horsepower in the side of administrative staff to be able to manage that and make sure that that thing continues to move forward in a smooth transition. The rest of it really is mostly just a snapshot of what we've talked about here. And again, the first bullet in the specific notes is I just want to reemphasize, this is not a staffing plan. It does not fix the problem. It only is an attempt to try to offer some stability to a problem that is nationwide, and that is a decrease in volunteers and the number of hours that volunteers have to give. So we need to figure out as a county. I would advocate, I think the chief shares the same vision. I know the association sitting here behind us as well need to continue to try to incentivize volunteerism, to try to figure out how we can remain connected with them and keep them engaged in the fight. And from that point, where those absences are, then we need to be prepared as government agencies to supplement that or augment that with career staffing so that we can provide the service when the public calls any hour of any day. And that's really where our mission is. So with that, I'll turn it back to Chief Lohr and,
Thank you, Dave. I want to emphasize to Mayor and Council that the direct benefit to the Phase 1 plan is that even though since Director Hayes' arrival, we have enjoyed the response of the unit out of Station 20 to all commercial building fires in the city on either the initial box alarm or a supplemental alarm, most of the time that was 2 personnel. Frequently it was 1, but with the Phase 1 plan, this will be 2 additional trained, certified, practiced firefighters available within the city limits, assuming they're not out doing something else, a water rescue at the river or a hazmat call on the interstate, et cetera. So that is a direct benefit to our operation. Beyond that, I think I can't add to anything that Director Hayes already said. We are trying to incentivize volunteer participation. It's hard to do, and it's not immediate returns. It takes a while to grow volunteers. And then you have to provide all the resources necessary to put the volunteers to work over time, whether that's uniforms, running gear, facility space, all those things. So you'll see some things in the operating budget proposal that are focused in that direction here in the city, in addition to what they're already doing in the county, hoping that we can gain some traction there. So I would open the floor up to questions for either the director or myself, and if there's anything we can add to that, let us know, please.
When do you plan on having these 8 hired?
so we're currently working through the hiring process at this point. We had advertised for firefighter 2 positions, which are the ones that are fully credentialed to work at the Special Operations Station. Unfortunately, we did not get the number of applicants that we had hoped for to fill 8 positions. So I immediately authorized the release of an advertising for firefighter 1s, which we knew there was a cache of people out there that just went off of that. So to give you a timing, we're currently in the middle. We just completed the firefighter 1 testing. We're grading scoring matrices actually this week. And there are conditional offers out to 4 of the firefighter 2s, and we expect in the next 2 weeks to make conditional offers to an additional 4 in the hopes of being on the Board of County Commissioners agenda the last meeting. I think it's January 30th. January 30th. So that would be the guess, the best guess if things stay on schedule where we can be. We're working through background checks and those things and the psych evals right now.
Is it a fair question to ask if any of those applicants are currently members of the Hagerstown City Fire Department?
I was going to ask that.
Yeah, so obviously, I think, I can't really get into a lot of discussion about that, but I think it's fair to say that there could be an impact to the Hagerstown Fire Department. And I have to leave it at that.
Is the hiring being done at a salary higher than what HFD is currently paying its employees?
Commensurate with,
Commensurate or higher?
commensurate with.
Okay. Thank you.
First, let me say that I've obviously had a lot of opinions on this issue. In 2010, as a commissioner, when folks would ask me what the big issue is, and I would always say, the 800-pound gorilla in the county's room in the next 10 to 15 years is the fire system, being able to adequately provide a paid fire system. I am not a believer that we're going to somehow reinvigorate a large-scale volunteer, fire and rescue system the way that we would envision it, or the way that the demand, necessitates it. One of the examples I'll use, and by the way, I want to say thank you, and my comments aren't directed at you if I direct any of frustration, because you're the first individual from the county to say, look, you know, in the next 10 years, there's a shortfall, the shortfall is big, and it's a structural issue that needs changed, and it's going to take money to do it. I mean, that's just a reality, and the politicians out there can accept it or deny it. You know, it's their choice, but it's coming regardless. One of the first examples I'll use is our meeting the other week at the company there in the North End and at Jimmy's company, and I believe it was the chief from Clear Spring that said, look, it was some part of the conversation we were having, but he said, you know, we've operated the last 16 hours before I came here this evening without a driver. Now, that was his comment, and I'm not taking that neither here nor there, but I think that should put into context when folks out there, when citizens out there hear that, you know, a company is failing on 5%, they're not really getting a true picture, and I say this at our meetings all the time, of the percentage light, and they're only seeing it as a reflection of the responses. So, for lack of a better way to put it, we are saved often by the fact that nothing's simply happening. In other words, the deficiency's there, it's just nothing's happening to trigger a response being necessitated. And if we were getting twice the responses, you know, or necessities for responses that we see now, on average, throughout the companies, you would see those numbers grow, because the bodies aren't there, at the stations to begin with.
Right. So I think, you know, what I'd add to that, and I don't disagree with what you're putting forth here, I think that's an accurate assessment. What the system has seen over the last 24 to 36 months is a position that we can't really ignore. We understand that, and even, I think, most would agree that even the volunteers in years past would be very reluctant to say, hey, we need help. But that's not the picture anymore. They're sitting right beside us. As a matter of fact, I think if anybody watched the Board of County Commissioners presentation, you saw sitting beside me was Kingsley Poole. Many of you know him, retired battalion chief from Hagerstown, who is the chair of the ESAC committee. And then it was Dale Hill and Jimmy Sprecher back here from the association, where we were a united front saying, look, the time has come for us to recognize that we need some people. Now, we don't want to abandon, and nor are we going to abandon the volunteer system. But if we continue doing more of what we've done, we will continue to drive the volunteer system out of existence. So let's change what we're doing. And really, I think where I take this, Kristen, and the point I've tried to bring home is we have to identify. We always didn't want to talk about dollars and cents. And even back at the time when you were part of the board, it was always a taboo. We don't want to scare people and say this is going to cost $10 million. But I take a different position. Our job is to identify what we think we're going to see. And if it's better than that, then we're in good shape, right? Because that's a benefit to budgets. But if we don't, from an elected body, identify and cost value that and let you know, then shame on us. Because you have no opportunity to plan for these things that are coming down the road. And you might have been the lone soldier back in the 2008 by yourself as being one of the elected people that maybe was able to foresee this. But we, as a leadership group in the emergency services, I think it is our goal, it has to be our championship to identify this to leadership, but to make sure that we talk about all the areas that have to be touched and are affected. And is there a cause and effect? You asked it, Lou, Councilman. Will there be effect on HFD? Most likely. Will there be an effect on the volunteer system? Most likely. But we can't avoid those effects. They're going to happen, whether they happen in 2018 or 2028. Those effects are going to happen.
Here's my concern with that. And I tried to express it at the meeting, and I'll try to do it again here. In this presentation, it says that existing part-time staffing, 17,520 hours of part-time hours available. It's a finite amount based on a budgetary demand, not on a community-driven demand. And it says utilized to provide limited assistance with the staffing of the volunteer stations. But it doesn't truly mean that. Because when I asked my question at our ESAC meeting, I said, does that include the volunteer stations inside of the city limits? And the answer was no, the volunteer stations within the city limits will not be eligible for that. And I'm just going to have to assume to some degree that that's in part because the city provides a level of service in addition to volunteer level that's there already. And then when I get the report from the association of all of the things that the county money goes to volunteer companies to cover the cost of annually, there are line items within those in which the in-city stations aren't included on. And I don't want to go into any of those today, but that's the reality. So, and then when I look at, and I actually pulled the page just now, and I said this at the ESAC meeting, the other concern I have is this. City of Hagerstown, this is our audit we just got a report on 45 minutes ago, $28.5 million in property taxes, $24.5 million in public safety, about $9 million of which is in fire and rescue that the city provides. And if the city didn't provide that, I would argue, and I've been to every one of these volunteer companies, at least once, I would argue that there are a number of volunteer companies within the city limits that would immediately fall within those manpower constraints if paid staff wasn't made available to them on the regular basis that it is, or apparatus and equipment were not made available by the city on the level that it currently is. I mean, that would happen. Some of these companies would have those immediate issues for which we're not eligible for what this is going to address, albeit it may indirectly address the necessity for the city to send out responses in some of those areas that it is now, because it's going to reduce that necessity by a certain number to do so during certain times of the day, daytime being, that most difficult moment. And so, for me, it's a little difficult when I sit here as a council member and as a citizen of the city, and I struggle a little to look at a budget and say, here's a $9 million expense that the city's taking on, and we're doing it, and we've been doing it for forever. And I'm not discounting the volunteer efforts that our volunteer companies within the city are still maintaining, especially ones that are doing so with a much greater degree of activity. But when I see that that's the level we're providing, and if that $9 million sort of investment in fire and rescue were gone tomorrow, the county would be in a much different shape as far as planning would go. I mean, immediately. I have to feel to some degree that the association appreciates having that input and authority over those operations, and our unions, frankly, appreciate having that input and authority over those operations, and the county appreciates to some degree having that input and authority over those operations, as long as the city continues to fund that $9 million bill. And at some point, I got to feel, as a city citizen, as the county, undertakes this endeavor, that those start equaling out. And I don't feel that way. I mean, that's not included in our tax differential. So as a city resident, I don't get that. It's the only service of that level that's not included in that tax differential, and it's the second most expensive one we have. And so that's where I have that difficulty of at what point, is the county, going to take that step? And I got to tell you, it's a little difficult to hear, and I asked the question at the last ESAC meeting as well, you know, and I don't think it's a question for me so much of, you know, is it gonna take Hagerstown firefighters? Because that's a reality, that's probably gonna happen. You're gonna advertise for positions, you know, men and women are gonna see that and they might wanna apply. Can't stop it. The difficulty for me is, and when I brought this up, one of the chiefs of one of the volunteer companies was a bit opposed to it, is what happens when firefighter X decides to, in some form or fashion, do both? And I know people say, well, that's a scheduling issue, you know, won't happen, et cetera, et cetera.
Your question's both full-time?
What if they do full and part? And all we're doing is sort of, you know, bleeding a turnip of available personnel.
So go back to my
Dry.
conversation about that balance of 80/20. Hence the reason we found the Community Rescue Service, we needed to be at an 80/20 split, so we were not subjected to a huge swing in availability of staffing. Now, I can tell you from the county's position, at least from the division's position, one of the applicants right now had expressed an interest to having 2 full-time jobs, one at their current and one with the county, and we've already taken the position that no, that would not be acceptable. Now, we're not going to take the position at this point because it would collapse the system, and I think it brings a whole plethora of other issues to the table that you can't have a part-time position elsewhere, because that already is happening unilaterally in our county, out our county, in and out. So that may be a longer-term conversation that has to happen down the road. But again, when you're just strictly talking about full-time positions for us, and I can't speak for Hagerstown, our position, as long as our county HR would be in the same position, is we would not allow 2 full-time positions in that world. But, you know, just to go through, and I know you said you understand that. I mean, I can't tell you how many people I've lost from Community Rescue Service to the HFD, to the Montgomery counties, to other EMS companies in Washington County alone. So, like I said, and that's why I emphasized that a little earlier, these unfortunately are going to be growing pains that we all are going to go through. And even once we are a significant employer of full-time staff, we're going to lose people to other jurisdictions and other opportunities. Sheriff Mullendore and I were together earlier today, and he was talking about the difficulties of maintaining his traffic force because of deputies leaving for other areas. So we're all in this boat sailing down a similar river with staffing. It's just how we're going to manage it and what's going to lead us forward. And again, I think to come back to an earlier conversation, they're big dollars. They just are, and I don't have a good story to that.
I would simply add that, and the director and I have had many conversations about this, but when you have full-time people, whichever way that works, supplemented by part-time people, there's continuous work hours that you have to be concerned about. So last night, as I recall, the Hagerstown Fire Department between midnight and 0700 ran 5 flooding conditions. If any of those people left this morning to work part-time somewhere else, that's a factor. If that person is going to ride an EMS unit, and we experienced this in Winter Storm Jonas, as the director said, the system was on the verge of collapse. We brought in National Guard on the 4th day because we had to give our people some stand-down time. They were just on the clock somewhere for 96 hours. That's a factor that we all have to consider and work together to resolve, is continuous work hours. And I think that as this plan evolves, we're going to see even more speed bumps. The guy that's due to start for me at 7:30 in the morning is getting off in Potomac Valley at 7 o'clock that morning after working the night side. Those are things that we haven't had to routinely deal with, that we're going to have to deal with, and it'll be incumbent upon the director and I really to work out some kind of reasonable solution there that most likely will involve some level of overtime expenditures. So, whichever way it goes. We have a limited pool of people that are trained and certified and practiced to do the jobs that we're talking about. And it's, the last employee I hired a month ago is from Altoona, Pennsylvania.
I think what I would also take an opportunity here, which is not directly related to the staffing plan in itself, but indirectly touches it and will touch it in the future, is the Consolidated Public Safety Training Center. We currently, as I had said, struggle to get enough applicants to meet the firefighter twos. Now, we got enough certainly to meet firefighter ones, but if the county moves into a staffing position, then we start hiring larger numbers, and of course, the HFD continues to staff full-time people, there is a likelihood that we will struggle to get enough applicants that are already trained and certified to actually meet our hiring needs. So the Public Safety Training Center, and this is where I would advocate that the mayor and council, look at the value of such a facility. That would be a true facility that would allow us to run a firefighter training academy from the ground up. Meaning we could take somebody that tests into a program with no certifications, run them through the academy course and a design curriculum. When they come out the other side, they are at the level of what we're trying to hire right now based off of resumes. And if you don't think that's a reality, you can basically pick up at the top of South Mountain and look west, clean through central Maryland until you get to the Eastern Shore, and all of those jurisdictions in the metro areas are doing the exact same thing because their hiring needs exceeded what they could hire already trained and certified. And it's just, it's a finite pool of people that we sometimes can't create unless we have the facility to create that. So the county's working aggressively there to figure out how we fund this site, and I think if we can bring this thing forward and get it to completion, it will be something that we'll be proud of as a county at whole, including the Hagerstown municipality itself. So. All right.
Anybody else, any questions for Dave and the chief?
Thank you for your time.
Thank
I
you.
appreciate it.
Thank you, guys. Good to see you, Dave. City administrator comments.
Nothing this evening, Mayor?
We'll start with Lou this evening.
Thank you, Mayor. Want to acknowledge CJ. Haven't seen him around in a while. It's always good seeing you, CJ. And the only other thing I have is, we have a lot of talk about the jobs that our first responders do and that nature, but it's that time of the year for us all to remember what it must be like to get the phone call at 2:30 in the morning when it's 10-degree wind chill below zero that you got to go out and fight a water main break. And we've sure had our slew throughout the country of them in our city, and I just want to give kudos to our staff to get up and do that. It is, and also, as the chief said, you hear about firefighters. I think one of the worst jobs a firefighter's got to have is the same thing, being called out to flooding calls at 3 in the morning in 10 below zero weather. So just want to acknowledge them and thank them for their work.
Thank you. Ms. McIntyre.
I concur, Lou. I think that it's quite a challenge, and thanks is never good enough, I don't think, for what you do, and for what your volunteers do for the emergencies. I have a lot to learn, so I've experienced in the last couple of weeks. I'm glad to be here. I hope I can remember everyone's name. That's quite a challenge, so it's a lot to learn, so thank you.
Kristen? Emily?
I do. Well, first of all, today is National Law Enforcement Appreciation Day, so Sergeant, Chief, the rest of you guys, thank you for all you do. Kim at Family Healthcare of Hagerstown took me on a tour of their facility today. If you guys have a chance, you should check it out. It's over on Cleveland Avenue, the old VA building. They've put a ton of money into it, completely redone it. They have primary care physicians work there. They have mental health services and dental. You can take your whole family, and it's kind of a one-stop shop. It's pretty amazing, and a good change to that building from what we had before. So I just wanted to thank her for that. And then lastly, I met with the mayor today to go over a couple ideas that I have that I want to just put out there, and then we can discuss further. Toward the end of last year, I'm kind of planning for my own business for 2018, and I thought about, why I was elected, and I think one of the reasons that people were confident in me enough to elect me was that I am a business owner, and they said, all right, we need to run this like a business and take your business ideas. So I started thinking about how I can take my business owner mind into this council person role and try to help the city. So I don't know if we do this now, and I apologize if we do, but I think it would be great if we had employee performance reviews for every department. I think within my own business, that's a very important step. Employees want lead, and they want to know what they're living up to, and that they are doing their job properly and what they can work on. I just think that's a very important aspect. So if that's not something that we do regularly, I think it would really help morale. Another thing I'd like to do as a council would be a survey to each department within the city, mayor and council and city administrator, to get the employees' perspective on how we're doing. What is the morale in City Hall? Is everyone confident in their job? Are they planning on leaving? Are they planning on staying? I think that's really important for us to gauge as a city to see where we're heading. But also the people who go out and are in the field every day tend to have a different perspective than what management does. I can tell you right now from my own business, my employees have a better idea of how to better run my business than I do, because I'm busy paying bills, doing the administrative broad stuff, and I think that happens in every department. So as we face these budget issues and different, the threat of staff reduction and everything, I think it would be great to engage our employees to see what ideas that they have, that they may have ideas that we don't think about ever, or that the management doesn't think about ever, because they're too worried trying to balance all the other tasks. So I'd really like to put something like that out to gain their perspective and see how we're doing as well. And then lastly, we had the PICR committee, the Permits Inspection Code Compliance Review Committee, that's been meeting for a year, which of course is going to meet next week to go over the results of what that has done. So as we're going into the next year, I took a look at Governor Hogan had a regulatory reform commission that has been meeting for the last 2 years. I'll send you guys the link. But they met for 2 years to not just pick on code and compliance and regulatory issues, but to say, in Maryland as a whole, how can we do better? How can we be open for business? And they met consecutively with specific agenda items all around, and then took that time to implement different changes to make Maryland open for business. So I think that we should follow in that footsteps. He had a list of 10 or 15 agenda items that I'll send out. But I think if we follow that, it apparently was very successful. Blackie Bowen, who's local here, was on the commission, and there was about 15 people appointed. I think it would be great to do that and engage our community as a whole. That way we're not just picking on permits, inspection, and code all the time and going down that path. I think if we have a group that's focused on rental registration, a group that's focused on crime-free ordinance, a group that is focused on code and permits, but also economic development, and different specialized groups that have one agenda, and that's only to make things easier, that it would be a good thing for the community, a good thing for morale, and then we can go on a similar campaign, just like Maryland's open for business, but Hagerstown is open for business. So that's kind of my personal agenda for 2018 for City Hall, and I hope you guys are on board. I'm done.
Okay. Well, thank you. Yes, and I'll get with the city administrator and try to put together some times that we can maybe sit down with our personnel director and try to implement some of these
As far as
ideas.
some employee engagement surveys and all, I'm working with our new director on that goal
Cool.
already.
With
Yep.
Wendy, good,
Yep.
good. All right, good. So we'll definitely make sure that we keep you updated. And
Yeah.
We'll put it on the agenda to discuss
Sure,
some solutions, okay?
absolutely.
All right, great. Mine is very lighthearted. Attended the donut drop on New Year's Eve. Mrs. McIntyre was there with her husband, and although I didn't see her go outside,
I don't blame you.
it was a balmy 10 degrees, and actually it was pretty well attended considering the temperatures. I know that there were a lot of donuts left over though. So hopefully next year the weather cooperates a little bit better and it won't be so frigid and people will actually come out and enjoy it. It was still a great time, a live band, it was really a good time. But I have to admit, when the fireworks went off, I was walking up the street to get in my car, so it was pretty chilly. We have some great things coming up in the future, and I know that Wednesday, tomorrow, is the first day of session, and I want to send out a good luck to all of our delegation members. Hopefully, I saw in the newspaper where they reported that this session will be about politicking, and I certainly hope not. I certainly hope that we get some things accomplished at the state level, because we need to keep moving. We can't take a whole year off and not move forward. So I know it's difficult, and I know everybody's going to be jockeying for some kind of position, but hopefully they can do their job at the same time. And I have faith in our delegation anyway, that they'll push our agenda items, and hopefully we get some movement on some of them. So good luck with this session, and that's it for me, and thank you all for coming, and we'll see you next Tuesday.